I really am enjoying this conversation. And just before we went on the break, we were talking about dots connecting backwards. But the part I'd like us to dig into right now is the people around you. Because sometimes when we're too close to a matter, it might be difficult for us to notice what's happening. So there was a moment in chapter 2. I think you were 9 years old around that time, and you were running around, playing around. There was an event that had been organized for His Highness the King. Then he was a prince, and you were running around with a Fanta bottle in your mouth. And for a moment you stopped and you looked at him. Okay, I love stories. and you looked at him, and then you went off to play, obviously. And then there was the village drunk, BGG. I think it was called BGG, the village drunk, who had a name for you that bordered on prophetic. I found that quite interesting in reading your story. And I'm going to ask this question again. Was there a point before you became queen that the people around you might have said something about you possibly having something special upon your life?
Not that I remember. Not that I remember. And that running around you just mentioned, when we were in Entebbe, I think that was in 1972 or 73, something like that. I stopped as a kid playing around and stared and ran away. So that was, we were a number of us playing around, and I think we were just wondering why, what's the fuss? All the, the grown-ups were very much paying attention to what was going on. And so we just got up and said, okay, we're tired. And we must have been there for a very long time, waiting for him. He came, and there were all these festivities going on. And so it was just a glance of...
And you still think it was random, Your Royal Highness? Do you still think it was random?
Yeah, you see, our grandparents my father used to take us out a lot on all these things.
Because he was a chief, right?
Yeah, or Mutaka. Yeah, so I think.
So you were around these circles quite a bit, even though you were not.
But during that time in 72, actually, that was when the kingdoms had been abolished, and the monarchy at that point wasn't in existence, so to speak. So this for them, for the son of Mutesa to be back, was something that, it was big. It was big. And I think he went to different places. But this particular place was in Entebbe, near church. I think it is called Kabaka. I don't know if that's still the name even today, but it's called Kabaka. I think it's part of the golf field. And this is where, I kind of remember it. So, precisely in terms of, on what was going on and how long we waited, and, as kids we were hungry, so they gave us soda. Then we started, we left the place and started running around, and so there he was at some point. So we had to go and say, oh, this is the person they were waiting for, and took a glimpse and then ran back to the playing ground and did our. So that was.
Okay, so let's bring it closer to 1993. And I got goosebumps reading this part of your book. And the reason I got goosebumps is because I was there in Nagalabi in 1993 as a 15-year-old. So just reading about the first time, I think that was the first time, if I'm not too sure, that the king spotted you. I think that's what I remember. But she'll correct me. At the coronation.
That year, but not in Nagalabi.
Okay.
It was after
After, okay.
Other, yeah.
So for me, I remember the days leading up to the king's coronation. There was no studying. It was the biggest event, because I was in King's College, Bordeaux. It was the biggest event. So we spent a lot of time preparing for that activity. And even though we didn't know much about the kingdom, there was such a sense of pride at being part of this grand event that was happening. So for me to imagine that somewhere at that point in time, I was there. And we had a few stories here and there of, at some point the king is going to have to get a queen. And of course, as children, we're not sure how exactly does that happen. How does one find a queen in an entire kingdom? So for me, it sort of felt like we knew the king, even though we had never, really met, because we'd been in Nagalabi when he was whatever. And one of my favorite parts of the book was actually when he proposed, much later. And
later.
Yes, much later.
Many years later.
I honestly didn't see that kind of proposal coming. What went through your mind at that moment? And I'm deliberate about not spoiling it for people.
Right.
On what the proposal was like, because I'd like you to tell the story.
Well, what was going on in my mind? Basically, I mean, as you may have read, it was very uneventful. This was via email. I think he was in Kampala, I was in New York. No, I was in Maryland. So, email. Okay. This what exactly happened. If you're ready, I'm ready.
I'm ready. That's it.
Are you ready? So I responded, I'm ready. So it was...
Did you even stop to think about it?
Not really. I mean, looking back, I don't know why I didn't think it was a joke. But then I took it, I think it's serious, yeah? So I looked at it and I was like, yeah, I'm ready too. I was 35. What was I waiting for really at that time? So I really took it as it came. I took it as it came. And it's not one of those things where you leave the email and call your friend quickly and say, guess what? No, I just took it as it came, really.
So the next thing is you say yes to this email proposal. I'm guessing that's not what you were expecting. I mean, many young people, when we're younger, we sort of have an idea of how we want it to happen, and we have all these funny things in our heads.
Yeah, but it happened differently, and I don't really think I cared a lot that it happened that way.
Yeah. It didn't make a difference. Obviously it doesn't. You're here right now. So you say yes to his proposal and His Majesty's proposal and start getting set for your wedding. And obviously moving back to Uganda, that was quite a bit for you. Close to 2 decades. It was close to 2 decades in the US. And finally coming home. And not just coming home, but literally being held into the throngs of tradition and expectations. What was going on in your mind, your heart, and your spirit, having to deal with all these things?
Right. You see, prior to our marriage, I did not think hard about what it is that I was getting into. Like I said, I was 35 years old and I was just ready to get married. I did not have any formed ideas on what it is, about this gigantic role that I was about to step into. Of course, it was obvious, with marriage, you expect a family. And of course, to support my husband's enormous role, by providing services that will contribute to the development of the region and hence the country. Yeah. But here I was, a queen in a culture institution that has stood for over 800 years. Moreover, by marriage, placed close to the epics of a culture value system within a modern world. So, but looking back, without knowing it then, it was also sort of like the beginning of the realization of my dream, a dream which I had had 18 years ago, 18 years, before then.
Which was having an impact.
About coming back home and having an impact in my country. You see, when I first left, that was in the early 80s, right after the elections of Obote II. And the country was in havoc. There was a lot going on. Very unstable in so many ways. People were being killed. I remember our neighbor was shot. A lot of things were happening in Uganda. So if you had a chance to get out, you'd get out. But for me, of course, I was lucky that prior to all that, when I was still in school, my mom, who had been in the US pretty much all her life, had already organized for me to leave Uganda after I complete my secondary school. But see, at that time when I left, I told everyone, I'm coming back in 5 years. because I'm coming back home. So they said, okay, we'll see that. People who go there never come back.
They never come back.
You see, so anyway, when I got there, of course, it wasn't 5 years. It was more than 5 years. 5 years passed. And I kept on saying, another 5 years, I'll be back. But during the time that I was there, I always felt that I'm going to go back home and work to be able to help somehow. After I finish school in the U.S., I'm going home, and then they would ask me, "But home is not such a great place. Why do you always talk about that?" I said, I think I'll by the time I'm done, I'm sure things will be much better off anyway, and I know I'll be going back. And so throughout all the school time that I was there during my university days and so on and so forth, I would work on, when I wrote during my coursework, it was all topics related to how do I help Uganda? If in the communications classes, how are we going to use communication for development in Africa, in Uganda? And so I always did things that were related to coming back home. I wasn't sure whether it was going to be with an NGO or coming home to work in the corporate world or to work as an entrepreneur. I didn't even know that much. All I knew is that at some point soon, I have to go back home. I will be going back home to work. And so in 1993, which you just mentioned, I did get a 6-month consultancy job. I wanted to try out, see how things are before I make that final decision to get back home.
And we're glad you came back home. Uganda is glad you came back home, and Uganda is glad you came back home. We will take another short break, but when we return, we are talking about how one becomes queen.